The weight of silence at Gate 7B. John Sterling had navigated the treacherous currents of global finance for decades. He'd stood in gleaming boardrooms overlooking cityscapes, where billion-dollar mergers were forged with a handshake. He delivered keynotes at international economic summits, his words shaping market trends, and he'd mentored countless young entrepreneurs, guiding them through the labyrinthine pathways of innovation. His signature was on contracts that had not just changed industries, but created entirely new ones. Yet none of that, not a single one of his considerable achievements, seemed to matter at Gate 7B. Dressed in a custom-tailored navy blue suit, its fabric whispering wealth with every movement, and carrying nothing but a slim, burnished leather briefcase and a first-class boarding pass, John had arrived at Capital City Airport expecting a quiet, uninterrupted flight. It was meant to be a moment of much-needed rest between a high-stakes acquisition meeting in London and a critical investor presentation in New York. Instead, he was met with suspicion, a fleeting but unmistakable look, a fractional pause, and then a question, sharp and laced with an almost saccharine condescension. "This is a first-class line, sir. Are you sure you're in the right place?" It wasn't the question itself that jarred him. John Sterling was a man who understood the subtle machinations of bias, the insidious ways it could manifest. It was a tone, the immediate, unshakable assumption that he didn't belong. Despite the name emblazoned on the ticket, his name, John Sterling, despite the platinum frequent flyer status that screamed elite traveler, the implicit message was clear. He couldn't possibly be who he said he was. And when he calmly presented his ID and confirmation, expecting at least a veneer of courtesy, he was met with something far worse than outright aggression. He was met with a dismissive chuckle, a glance exchanged between agents, a palpable sense of being ignored, dismissed, utterly devalued. But John Sterling wasn't new to this particular brand of indignity. He understood how true power moved, not in a clamor of protest or show of force, but in a profound, unwavering weight of silence. He simply stepped aside, moving with an almost preternatural calm, pulled out his smartphone, and made a single, brief call. What unfolded next wouldn't merely delay a flight. It would send seismic tremors through an entire airline's corporate structure, a stark, irrefutable reminder to everyone watching that sometimes the most devastating response is no response at all. Just results. The airport terminal hummed with its familiar symphony. The low rumble of rolling suitcases, the distant, muffled cadence of announcements, and the occasional, resigned sigh of travelers worn down by the perpetual grind of delays and routine. John Sterling moved through the automatic doors of Terminal 3 with a quiet, almost regal confidence. His crisp navy suit, tailored with impeccable precision, seemed to have been crafted just yesterday, perfectly accentuating his broad shoulders and commanding presence. In his hand, the sleek leather briefcase felt like a natural extension of his arm, and tucked neatly into his jacket pocket was a first-class boarding pass, his name, John Sterling, prominent in bold letters. He had boarded hundreds of flights in his illustrious career. Private jets, commercial first class, even middle seats back in a lean, hungry days when money was tight and ambition was the only currency. But today wasn't meant to be anything different. Just another routine business trip. Another high-stakes meeting. Another deal to close. As he approached the priority boarding line, John offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod to the gentleman ahead of him, queuing up as anyone else would. The moment he stepped into the velvet-roped lane, specifically designated for first-class passengers, he felt it. That split-second hesitation. The subtle, almost imperceptible glance from the gate agent, whose pre-programmed smile faltered just slightly, a tiny crack in the professional veneer. The woman at the podium, a supervisor with sharp, almost clipped tone and an air of practiced professionalism, looked up. Her eyes, narrowed just a fraction, seemed to scrutinize him, as if something in the equation simply didn't add up. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice a practiced saccharine, though her eyes remained cold, untouched by any genuine warmth. "This line is for first-class boarding." John met her gaze with an unwavering calm. "Yes, I know. That's me." He retrieved the elegant boarding pass from his pocket, presenting it along with his driver's license. She barely afforded him a glance before a small, almost inaudible laugh escaped her lips, a sound that implied the situation was somehow amusing, a private joke at his expense. "I just want to be sure," she stated, her voice still dripping with unmistakable, almost suffocating patronization. Another agent joined her, a younger man with a name tag that read Kyle. He took one look at John and a snort escaped him. "Nice try," he muttered, shaking his head with an air of theatrical disbelief, as if John were attempting some elaborate prank. "Sir, you might want to check again. This is priority boarding for elite and first-class customers." John Sterling stood quietly, his expression unreadable, watching the two of them exchange a smirk. It was the kind of smirk that spoke volumes without a single word being uttered, a shared understanding, a silent agreement of judgment. Around him, other passengers filtered past without incident. They smiled, chatted idly, scanned their own tickets. No questions, no raised eyebrows. Just him, just a black man in a bespoke suit being told, implicitly and explicitly, that he must be mistaken, that he couldn't possibly belong, that he didn't argue. He didn't plead for understanding or sympathy. He simply repeated with the quiet, unshakable calm of someone utterly accustomed to being underestimated. "My name is John Sterling. That ticket is mine, and yes, it's first class." But they didn't budge. Instead, the supervisor rolled her eyes, a gesture so brazenly dismissive, and waved in the next passenger, as if to underscore their point, to signal his utter irrelevance. With that, John Sterling simply stepped aside, not out of defeat, not out of resignation, but with a composure so profound, so utterly self-possessed, that they couldn't possibly comprehend its depth. Because while they saw a man out of place, a perceived imposter, John Sterling was already several moves ahead, orchestrating a cascade of consequences they couldn't even begin to imagine. John moved to the periphery of the boarding area, not because he accepted their prejudiced judgment, but because he had learned, through years of navigating complex power structures, that the most potent response to disrespect wasn't noisy confrontation, but crystal clear, undeniable clarity. He pulled out his phone, a sleek device, and checked the time. Still early. The flight wouldn't begin boarding for another 15 minutes. More than enough time. He watched as the gate agents continued their routine, checking in passengers. Some glanced curiously in his direction, their expressions betraying a flicker of unease. Others pretended not to notice, their gazes fixed stubbornly ahead. The murmurs had begun already, soft and buzzing, like agitated bees. People always noticed when something felt fundamentally off, even if they dared not articulate it aloud. The supervisor, now visibly uncomfortable, kept her attention rigidly fixed forward, assiduously avoiding John's calm, unwavering gaze. Kyle, the younger agent, avoided looking at him altogether, his earlier smirk having vanished, replaced by a subtle tension in his shoulders. The very air had shifted, charged, uneasy. Yet, they still believed they were in control. John Sterling allowed them that illusion. For now, he opened his contacts list and scrolled to a name labeled only as Alpha Bravo. It was a short call, barely 30 seconds. He didn't raise his voice. There was no hint of anger or demand for special favors. He simply stated the facts, with the precision of a surgeon. What had happened, the gate number, the flight number, and a request for confirmation that the names of the individuals involved would be thoroughly documented. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, possessing a tone reserved for matters of genuine, significant concern. "Give us 10 minutes, the voice stated, clear and authoritative. "Do not board the flight." He ended the call, returning his phone to his pocket, resuming his quiet vigil off to the side, like a man patiently waiting for the world to catch up to an inevitable truth. The gate agents continued boarding, but now their glances towards him came quicker, more frequent, almost furtive. Something was happening. They didn't know what yet, but the subtle vibrations of change were beginning to hum. Then the calm, disembodied voice over the intercom. "Attention, passengers for Flight BA 789 to Dublin. We're experiencing a brief delay in boarding. Please remain in the gate area. We'll provide an update shortly." The supervisor stiffened, her movements becoming jerky. Kyle frowned, a distinct line forming between his brows. John Sterling, still silent, still utterly still, watched as the balance of power, so confidently wielded moments before, began its inexorable shift. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. He hadn't needed to utter a single threat or plea. He had simply made one call. And now, the wheels of consequence were already turning, slowly, but with an unstoppable momentum. The moment the announcement echoed to the vast terminal, a ripple of collective impatience spread through the waiting passengers. Some groaned, others instinctively checked their phones, assuming the usual culprits: adverse weather, a minor mechanical issue. But John Sterling knew better. That delay wasn't about atmospheric turbulence or a minor timing glitch. It was about accountability. Arriving at gate 7B faster than anyone at that counter had ever anticipated. The supervisor at the counter, her earlier composure completely shattered, tapped her keyboard with an almost frantic energy, pretending to be absorbed in some urgent task. Her pre-recorded cheerful tone had evaporated entirely, replaced by something clipped, uncertain, bordering on fear. Kyle, the younger agent, paced agitatedly behind the counter, his smirk definitively gone, replaced by a growing, visible tension in his jaw. They whispered, their heads close, exchanging frantic glances, checking monitors and message threads only they could access. Something was fundamentally, irrevocably wrong, and they were the only ones still in the dark about the precise nature of what was about to descend upon them. John Sterling remained as still as a statue, his hands folded calmly over the handle of his briefcase. He wasn't savoring their discomfort. He wasn't built for petty revenge. He simply believed in allowing systems to answer for themselves. And when you sat at the highest tables with the architects and engineers who built those very systems, one phone call could become a lever with far-reaching, devastating weight. 8 minutes after his call, a woman in a sharply tailored dark gray blazer strode toward the gate with an almost alarming urgency, yet without a hint of panic. Her badge, conspicuously displayed, flashed the word director. She didn't spare a glance for John Sterling. She went directly to the two agents, her movements precise, her purpose clear. There was no pretense of a smile this time, no passive dismissiveness. Only a low, intense, and profoundly direct conversation, exchanged in hushed, clipped tones. The supervisor tried to defend her actions, gesturing wildly, her body language screaming defensive posturing. John could read it all, even from a distance. The desperate gesturing, the shifting weight from foot to foot, the sudden, telling lack of eye contact. Passengers were now fully aware that something truly unusual was transpiring. The boarding line had completely stalled. A crew member stood idly with a tablet, receiving no further direction. The jet bridge door remained resolutely closed. An older gentleman in a tweed blazer, shrewd eyes darting between the agitated agents and the unmoving John Sterling, slowly began to piece the puzzle together. A young woman engrossed in her laptop finally looked up and whispered to her friend, "I think they messed with the wrong guy." John Sterling didn't flinch. He wasn't waiting for a confrontation. He was waiting for recognition. Not for himself, not for an ego boost, but for the stark, undeniable truth of what had just occurred to be acknowledged and accepted. And when the director finally turned, her gaze meeting his across the crowded terminal, he gave her a respectful, almost imperceptible nod. She responded with a quiet, understanding tilt of her head. The balance had irrevocably shifted. The agents, once so sure of their ground, now looked like passengers with no confirmed destination, lost in a sudden corporate fog. Behind the polished facade of the airport gate, John Sterling's single phone call had traveled much further, much higher. The director who arrived at gate 7B was merely the first ripple in a rapidly expanding pond. In a high-rise executive suite halfway across the country, top executives had been immediately looped in. One of them had seen John Sterling's name, just weeks earlier, a brief but impactful entry in the preliminary reports for a potential billion-dollar acquisition. Another had personally met him at an exclusive global conference where he spoke with profound authority on corporate accountability and global equity initiatives. When his name flagged with an urgent tag lit up on their internal incident report feed, it wasn't just acknowledged, it was immediately escalated. The airline's executive crisis protocol, a rarely triggered but highly efficient system, was activated. This wasn't just another customer complaint, a minor inconvenience to be smoothed over with a polite apology. This was a reputational wildfire waiting to spark, involving a man with undeniable reach, immense influence, and a deep, formidable network of legal and media connections. A brief error in judgment by two low-level gate agents had now metastasized into a potential front-page headline, an international PR nightmare with national weight and global implications. Back at Capital City Airport, the boarding monitors for Flight BA 789 refreshed, the display now starkly showing delayed, awaiting clearance. The agents at the gate weren't speaking, their earlier whispers replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. The director had pulled them into a side conversation, their voices lowered urgent, almost frantic murmurs, clipped instructions delivered with a steely edge. One of the agents looked utterly stunned, the color drained from his face. The other looked dangerously pale, on the verge of collapsing. Meanwhile, a second, more senior regional director was already en route, rushing through traffic. The airline's legal department had been notified. HR had already opened a comprehensive incident report, a digital file growing by the second. John Sterling remained in precisely the same spot. His phone hadn't rung again. He hadn't made another call. There was no need. What was happening now wasn't about him demanding justice or extracting a pound of flesh. It was about an entire corporation, a vast global entity, slowly, painfully, realizing what justice truly looked like when it was served without warning from within its own carefully constructed systems. By the time the regional director arrived, looking grim and utterly exhausted, security camera footage had been reviewed, official statements had been meticulously collected, and the flight crew had been formally informed not to board the aircraft. The plane remained at the gate, its doors sealed, its passengers growing increasingly restless. And throughout it all, John Sterling didn't raise his voice once. He simply watched, a silent, powerful sentinel, as the airline began to understand, with dawning horror, what it truly meant to underestimate the wrong person, and how quickly power could shift when dignity, so casually denied, returned with the force of an unforgiving storm. IT was nearly 2 hours later before the official apology finally came. Not a perfunctory email, not a quiet, whisper side. This was a real in-person apology, delivered face-to-face by a senior vice president, a man whose presence exuded corporate authority, who had been pulled mid-sentence from a critical regional strategy meeting and rushed to the airport. He arrived out of breath, his impeccably tailored blazer slightly rumpled, a sheen of sweat forming at his temples. Not from the heat of the terminal, but from the raw urgency of the situation. He knew exactly who John Sterling was, his resume, his influence, his impeccable reputation. More importantly, he understood, with a sickening clarity, the monumental weight of what had just transpired at Gate 7 beat-up passengers, growing increasingly impatient with the prolonged delay, had begun whispering, their murmurs growing louder, more speculative. Some recognized John Sterling now, his face vaguely familiar from a recent magazine feature, a television interview about his latest philanthropic venture, or a business summit clip shared widely online. But it wasn't mere recognition that changed the atmosphere. It was a palpable shift in posture, the way the gate agents now stood, silent and almost impossibly small, as the senior vice president approached John Sterling with solemn, practiced humility that bordered on reverence. Mr. Sterling, the man began, his voice low but clear, carrying a surprising resonance in the bustling terminal. On behalf of the entire airline, I want to offer our deepest, most sincere apologies for the entirely unacceptable treatment you received at this gate. It was beyond egregious, and we take full, unreserved responsibility. John Sterling looked up, his gaze steady, unreadable, giving nothing away. He didn't interrupt. He didn't speak. He simply allowed the man to articulate his carefully rehearsed apology, because it was never about the apology itself. It was about whether they truly understood why it needed to be made, the profound injustice it sought to address. The vice president continued, explaining in precise, corporate speak that the incident had been thoroughly documented, that the involved employees were being placed under immediate, indefinite review, and that a formal, comprehensive report detailing all actions taken will be delivered directly to John Sterling's office by the end of the day. John gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No dramatic speech. No triumphant, gloating declaration. Just a quiet, unwavering resolve that had defined his career. "I'd like the names of everyone involved sent directly to my legal team," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Include full timestamps, detailed actions taken, and any and all footage reviewed. And make absolutely sure it's complete. No redactions. The vice president nodded quickly, almost too quickly, his eagerness to show compliance palpable. John Sterling then took one step forward, pulled a business card from his pocket, polished, minimal, bearing only his name and a private contact email, and handed it to perspiring executive. "You have until 5 p.m. Pacific time," John Sterling stated, his voice devoid of emotion, yet ringing with undeniable finality, and with that he turned and walked away. No boarding the flight. No further exchange. Just a lingering weight of silence and the indelible trail of consequences left behind, rippling to the very fabric of a global corporation. Be why the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Not from John Sterling himself, for he remained characteristically silent. It spread from other passengers who had witnessed the bewildering spectacle, from airline staff members who whispered about the sudden influx of executives, from airport employees who had seen a routine flight devolve into corporate chaos. A sharp-eyed journalist picked up the thread. A concise, incredulous social media post from an eyewitness went viral. And suddenly, the headlines blared across every major news outlet. Prominent CEO denied boarding due to alleged racial bias. Airline execs forced to respond. The airline, reeling from the sudden, intense scrutiny, issued a formal statement within 24 hours. It spoke of profound regret, an unwavering commitment to diversity and inclusion, and immediate, comprehensive policy review. But what stood out most, subtly but unmistakably, was the admission that the man they had so casually dismissed wasn't just any disgruntled customer. He was someone with the undeniable power to press pause on an entire multi-billion-dollar operation with a single, unvoiced phone call. Internal changes followed swift and decisively. New sensitivity training modules, long stalled in committee, were fast-tracked. A full, draconian audit of frontline employee conduct was immediately ordered. Several employees were quietly suspended, their careers effectively terminated. HR conducted countless, rigorous interviews. Legal departments reviewed every conceivable angle of exposure, preparing for the inevitable fallout. Investors, spooked by the sudden reputational hit, called with urgent concern. John Sterling, for his part, remained exactly as he had been at Gate 7B, silent. He didn't tweet. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't need to, because what mattered most wasn't the deafening noise that followed the incident. It was a clear, unequivocal message, delivered without ever raising his voice. A stark reminder that true respect isn't earned by money or by power, but by the fundamental, simple recognition of human dignity. And when that dignity is denied, even quietly, the consequences can echo louder and resonate farther than any apology ever could.